Top of the morning to you and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: nuclear watchdog IAEA concerned Ukraine's offensive in Zaporizhia region increases nuclear risk. Poland, Baltic states threaten to shut Belarus border if critical incident occurs. Plus, White House says it's increasingly confident Wagner Group boss Prigozhin died in plane crash. Thank you for joining us. The head of the world's nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, says Ukraine's offensive in the Zaporizhia region has increased the risk of Europe's largest nuclear power plant. Russian news agency quoted Rafael Grossi as saying, "I'm talking about the region, not the station itself, which increases the likelihood of an attack on the station or damage to it." Mr. Grossi was speaking at a Swedish Institute of International Affairs event. He added that any accident at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant would affect neighboring countries and Europe as a whole. Video released by the Ukrainian 36th Separate Marine Infantry Brigade purports to show sappers clearing fields planted with Russian mines in Zaporizhia region. Occupying Russian troops have shown landmines and booby traps across hundreds of miles of Ukraine's front, a tactic that Kyiv's commanders describe as the primary reason why the summer counteroffensive has slowed down. Poland and the Baltic states have threatened to close their borders with Belarus entirely if a critical incident involving Wagner mercenaries takes place. The Polish Interior Minister said this amidst rising tensions on NATO's eastern flank. EU and NATO members Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, which share a border with Belarus, have been increasingly concerned about border security since hundreds of Russian Wagner mercenaries arrived in Belarus at the instance of President Alexander Lukashenko. The countries have also seen an increase in the number of mainly Middle Eastern and African migrants trying to cross the border in recent months and accuse Belarus of facilitating them. Meanwhile, Poland has closed all but one border crossing point with Belarus this year following the imprisonment of a journalist of Polish origin and expulsion of Polish diplomats. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and his Turkish counterpart Hakan Fidan will hold talks in Moscow in the near future. That's according to the state TASS news agency, which cited the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. Turkey is trying to persuade Russia to return to the deal that allows for the export of grain via Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's office says President Putin will skip the Group of 20 summit in India next month and will send his foreign minister instead. Mr. Modi's office said he spoke with President Putin by telephone, expressing an understanding for his decision not to attend the summit. Prime Minister Modi also thanked President Putin for Russia's consistent support to all initiatives under India's G20 presidency. India has not condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine and has increased its purchases of Russian oil during the 18-month war. The White House of the United States has indicated that Wagner mercenary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin may indeed have died in the plane crash in Russia last week. Russian President Vladimir Putin sent his condolences to Mr. Prigozhin's family on Thursday, breaking his silence after the mercenary leader's plane crashed 2 months following the mutiny he led against Russia's army chiefs.
We are increasingly confident that Prigozhin died in the plane crash that took place on August 23rd, this past Wednesday. I don't have any new assessment for you on this, so I'll just leave it there.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's defense minister says there is no conflict between Ukraine and their Western partners over military strategy in the ongoing counteroffensive. He made the comment at a press conference in Kiev. Reznikov added that Ukraine's commander-in-chief regularly meets his Western counterparts and that everything is going to plan, as discussed with Ukraine's Western partners, while Kyiv is still planning the counteroffensive and arming up. A military spokesman told Ukrainian television Kyiv's forces were continuing to fortify their positions in the retaken element of Robotyne on the southern front, Ukraine's main focus so far in the offensive. Now let's talk to Associate Professor, Department of International Relations, Metnikov National University, Odessa, Ukraine, Mr. Vladimir Dubovik. Mr. Dubovik speaks to us from Regensburg in Germany. Good morning, Dobroho ranko. Welcome.
Dobroho ranko, good morning. Good to be here.
Good to have you. Could we begin in Germany where you are? We've had reports from yesterday indicating, and you may explain that for us, dissent over or protest over the supply of weapons to Ukraine from Germany. These Germans are saying that enough that supplying these weapons to Ukraine is escalating the war. Germany is, as has been propounded by many, is the second biggest ally of Ukraine in terms of military aid and equipment and cash. And this follows the German foreign policy. So is there an increasing number of Germans who are not supporting the official German government position on the supply of military aid to Ukraine? Is that number significant enough to cause concern for the German government?
Right. It's a great question. I think that the number of people who are objecting maybe to sending more weapons to Ukraine is steady in Germany, is not growing, and it's a very small number. I mean, of course, these people can do demonstrations and various public actions, and that attracts attention. So anytime even like 10 or 100 of them gets in the main square of any town or any city, the media is there right away, so it's covered by media. But at the same time, the public opinion polls, sociological polls tell us that Germans are still pretty much united behind the idea that we should support Ukraine, Germany should support Ukraine. That definitely includes hosting refugees, of which there is a huge number here in Germany, and I've met many of those people, and then they have only good things to say and praise the hospitality of Germans, many with small children and large families and so on. It also includes, as you said, financial assistance to Ukraine, non-military stuff, which is very much needed for Ukrainian economy, for Ukrainian government to function, but also weapons, yes, quite a lot of weapons. Often Germany is in a crosshair of criticism because of their delays. That was the case on Leopard tanks, some other military systems. Now there is big discussion about the long-range missile system called Taurus. Should Germans give it to Ukraine? Should not? If they give it to Ukraine, maybe they should limit the range at which this missile operates, so that Ukrainians would definitely not be able to use it against the Russian targets on the territory of Russia. So there's many debates, and also within administration. Here, of course, the government, because it's a coalition government, that complicates things. Basically, it's three main parties. The party that are actually losing right now in polls, and many other parties are increasing their influence according to the polls, so that makes the coalition government nervous. That complicates things, but at the same time, Germany is still pretty much a loyal and persistent and principled member of pro-Ukrainian coalition. The people here in Germany, some of them, after many, many years of peace movement, of pacifism, of being convinced that Germany shouldn't play any decisive role in international affairs and definitely not support any parties in any war in the world, that's been a major kind of undertone and current narrative, most persistent, dominant narrative here in Germany for decades. Some people are feeling that maybe Germany shouldn't help either Ukraine or Russia, but they're most definitely not the majority, and there is no signs that they might become that they can have the numbers to prevent the German government from continuing supporting Ukraine.
Professor, share with us, if you will, your experience in Germany. 25,800,000 border crossings from Ukraine into countries, including Germany, and also the countries like Belarus itself and Russia itself. who, from the number of refugees, people who've left Ukraine to be in these countries, is there an increasing number of people coming into Germany in your experience? And how did you feel when you had to make the decision? Are you in Ukraine because of this conflict? Are you in Germany because of this conflict?
No, I'm not. I actually spent the last academic year in the United States. I was teaching as a scholar at risk, the research position there, and visiting professor, University of Tufts near Boston. But right now I'm visiting my friends who are refugees. And therefore I'm meeting a lot of people who are refugees. And just a few days ago, on August 24th, for instance, there was Independence Day of Ukraine. So the local Ukrainian community, people who lived here before the war, but mostly people who came since the large war started, so since February last year. I met them, I talked to them, and they feel that they are very much welcomed. There are some occasional cases when people would be grudging and saying things like, I mean, why are you here? You can go back home. Most of your country is fine. We are tired of spending some of our tax-paying money on this, on you being here. And general anti-refugee mood is here in the country as well. I mean, for instance, alternative for Deutschland, for Germany, AfD, the major party on the right wing, it's really a right-wing party, and it actually increased their influence in recent weeks and months, according to the polls. One of their staples of their position, the main points of their position, like for many similar parties in Europe, is anti-immigration, and therefore they don't really distinguish much between, let's say, immigration from the Middle East or Africa or Ukraine. They just basically say all immigration is bad and Germany should be for Germans. So we've heard that at some point like 78 years ago. So that's troubling, of course. But still, they're not a majority. And most Germans are showing a lot of empathy and solidarity and compassion, and understand that Ukrainians, specifically the people we're talking about here, the elder people, the mothers with small children, they need support because they cannot return to the country where it's just not safe, and children dying every day.
As Ukraine continues its counteroffensive and anticipates the delivery of F-16, over 61, I believe, in number, promised by the nations, including the United States, an incident occurred involving a Ukrainian fighter pilot whose name is Andrei Pilshikov, nicknamed Juice, highly regarded in Ukraine as a standout fighter pilot. He perished in a training accident involving combat aircraft over some area over Kyiv. Now, I bring this up also, obviously, to commiserate with the Ukrainian people over this significant loss, because he was one of the officials or the pilots from Ukraine who presented at the United States Congress for assistance for the United States to supply F-16s to Ukraine. Now, he died in a training accident. During World War II, and I'm sure in previous wars, a lot of planes were lost during training accidents. It shows how great a deal training for F-16, being an F-16 pilot is, and air combat is. It's a very significant part of the losses that one can take when you anticipate the delivery of F-16s. So as the country prepares to take the battle to the skies, what are your thoughts about how prepared the Ukrainian air pilots will be for the F-16s when they do arrive? Not to forget that some of these planes might be lost in training accidents such as this.
Yeah, well, I mean, anyone can learn to fly an airplane after a certain experience and education and training. The problem is, of course, that normally it takes time, more time. We are in the wartime right now in Ukraine, so we are forced for our pilots to learn how to fly these new airplanes faster than usual. So because we need them at the battleground, at the front line right now. Now we have some Air Force, which is still diminished and smaller much in numbers than the Russian Air Force, but they've been really very helpful and heroical, really, in terms of what they do. It's not even like a combat, airplane to airplane combat, but it's mostly supporting the ground troops, so-called close ground support. And also interdicting and really catching some of the Russian missiles flying into Ukraine. They can do that from air. So we need air force, of course, and for the most offensive, successful offensive, large-scale offensive, we also need air force, because everybody is saying like all the major offensives historically, and also if you look at the theory in the textbooks of the major Western militaries, including American, the large-scale offensive of the scale that Ukraine is doing right now is basically impossible without air force support. So we need those F-16s. In terms of the accident, these things happen. Not only we lost this guy who is a real hero, and he's been very public about his role and that Ukraine needs more airplanes, who you mentioned, but also two very experienced other pilots. This happens in any aircraft. And just another day, for instance, there was the crash of a helicopter of U.S. Marines in Australia near Darwin. 3 people died, 20 injured. So do we need to make assumption because of that accident that Americans can fly helicopters, that Marines should be trusted with helicopters? Of course not. This happens in the peaceful times, and there's no war in Australia, luckily, right now. So in Ukraine, there is a war. So, I mean, our pilots feel the tension and pressure on them to learn to fly different airplanes and so on. And, anyone can learn. I mean, I remember in American history, which is familiar to me, and I teach American history of foreign policy, in the Second World War. There was, for instance, formed the air attachment, the unit, called Tuskegee Airmen from African Americans, from Black Americans. And a lot of people were saying they can fly. I mean, what are you talking about? African Americans can fly such a sophisticated machine as an airplane. And what do you know? Of course, they learned to fly, and they were heroic, and they actually were covered with medals in the wars by the end of the war. So the logical follow-up what I just said on this is that Ukraine need F-16s. We would have a nice and capable, educated pool of pilots, and they'll be able to operate these machines. And Ukraine definitely needs it. For defending itself, for continuing to with offensive, whatever we're doing right now, Ukrainian military is defending ourselves, because we don't have any offensive plans in terms of getting into Russian territory, only to liberate our occupied lands.
Well, if you say that, then why these drone attacks that are occurring inside Moscow? What's happening in those cases?
Yes, this is a tactics to show to Russians that they cannot just wage the war miles and miles away from their own hometowns and not feel the pressure. This is very psychological, mostly, thing that the Ukrainian special services are doing. I don't think they are understanding that we are actually, trying to get to some big targets. This is just to show to Russians that you cannot escape the war. You started it in the next door country, big country, adjacent to Russia, so you cannot just live your lives happily ever after. And also note, of course, that most of those drone attacks are attacking buildings in the middle of the night, office buildings. So here, Ukrainians are definitely different from what Russians are doing, because they often attack civilian targets and people dying in their apartment buildings. Also, outside of Moscow and many other places, most of Ukrainian drone attacks are against airfields, reservoirs of the gas and oil and everything. So that's really different from what Russia is doing with their missiles and their drones, because they're often attacking the civilians and people die in big numbers who are not military. But with Ukrainians, it's some demonstrative, symbolic attacks, say on Russia, on Moscow, and also many attacks on military targets.
Is this caution because the war will be significantly escalated beyond the capacity of both nations to cope with? Because if Russia is attacking Ukraine in its own territory, as some schools of thought have propounded, why shouldn't Ukraine attack Russia in their own territory with the same skill that the Russians are mustering? What's good for the goose is good for the gander.
Right, I guess you're right. I mean, and that's a popular way of thinking, and a lot of people agree with that. Like, yeah, Russia's attacking Ukrainian territory. We have all right to attack Russian territory. But we don't have, unlike Russia, we don't have any aspiration to include any of their lands into Ukrainian state. So that's a big difference. I mean, they attacked, they occupied the land, they conducted so-called referenda, and they also announced so-called annexations of those territories into Russia. Even including some cities that are currently controlled by Ukrainian government, they insist that they should belong to Russia. So we have nothing of that sort. I mean, with some of the adjacent Russian regions like Kursk, like Voronezh, like Ryazan, like some others, we are not saying we have any plans, any claims on those territories. We just attack them to show that we can actually fight back. We need for Russians to understand that this war is big. It's not just expeditionary imperialistic war. When they send their army somewhere and that army, does damage and destroy buildings and so on and kill people, and you just live your life like you did before February 22, like nothing happened. It's very important psychological operation, psychological element of pressure to show to Russians that the war is a serious thing. If you started the war, if you brought trouble into the neighbor's house, then the neighbor can fight back. And that includes some danger for your own house. So I guess that's a logic that many Ukrainians understand, and Russians should understand as well, that they started the fire, and that fire can actually get to burn them too.
Finally, diplomatic relations between Belarus and Poland couldn't be worse at this point. It can be, and it's increasingly becoming so, to the extent that Poland, as we have reported this morning, is threatening to close all its borders with Belarus should there be an incident involving the Wagner mercenary fighters. They've already closed all their borders but one. They've sent 10,000 troops to the border with Belarus. They're really raining on the parade of Belarus. Is Poland making as much of it as it is, or they're making too much of it as it should be?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, of course, there is certain danger and always a tension on the border. A few years ago, Belarus with Russia weaponized migration. They basically were sending people, forcing people to cross the border into Poland with their machine guns and everything. And of course, Poles tried to prevent that from happening. So that created tension. Since then, they're building the wall, they're increasing their presence on the border posts. The Poland does. But at the same time, I don't think there is much of a danger of Wagner being in Belarus, for instance. First of all, there was a lot of Russian troops in Belarus already before that, including in western parts of Belarus adjacent to Poland. Second of all, Wagner is now decapitated, and Wagner is much smaller in numbers. Like a few months ago, maybe half a year ago, they had something like 50,000 fighters. They now apparently have maybe something like 10,000 fighters at most. Some of them came to Belarus, and then there were reports that they are leaving Belarus, and so on. So I think the Polish government is doing the right thing, being prudent and cautious, and about what kind of dangers they might face. So why not bring extra troops to the border? But at the same time, I don't think the Belarus, or even Russia for that matter, would use Belarus for a bigger, serious attack at Poland. And Poland is always been very mindful of the dangers coming from the east, specifically from Russia, historically and in present day. And also, Poland is going to have big elections in the coming few months, and therefore it's a very delicate moment for them. So especially they are aware that someone might try to create problems for them to show the government is not competent on something, and that's why they are rather would increase their military presence on the border just in case. But me personally, I'm completely sure that there will be no serious major challenge to Polish troops there. Not to mention that Polish troops are really well equipped and very well trained, so they would deal easily with some of those attempts to cross into Poland if those to happen.
Thank you, Professor Diakouyou, for your time this morning. We hope both sides make peace and not war. Professor Vladimir.
Yeah, it was my pleasure to be with you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. That's Professor Vladimir Dubovik, Associate Professor, Department of International Relations, who joined us from Germany. Coming up, Kremlin plays down significance of second vessel passing via Ukraine's Black Sea corridor. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. You are in the sophomore stretch of today's coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. One person is dead, 7 others injured after Ukrainian shelling in the Russian-occupied Donetsk region yesterday. That's according to the head of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, Denis Pushilin. In a post on Telegram, Mr. Pushilin says the person killed and 2 of the injured were in Horlivka, and the injuries are dire. The Russian-backed official added that another 5 were injured in districts of the city of Donetsk, with several critical facilities sustaining damage. The head of the Russian-occupied DPR also claimed that cluster munitions were used. Ukraine is proclaiming that its troops have liberated the southeastern settlement of Robotyne and are trying to push further south in their counteroffensive against Russian forces. Ukraine's defense ministry posted a video on social media platform X of soldiers describing the liberation and raising the flag in the settlement. Russia has not confirmed the Ukrainian advance. In its statement, Russia's defense ministry says Moscow's troops had repelled attacks by Kiev's forces near the region. The settlement is about 10 kilometers south of the front line town of Orikhiv in the Zaporizhia region on an important road towards Tokmak, a Russian-occupied road and rail hub. Meanwhile, Russia scrambled 2 fighter jets to ward off 2 U.S. drones flying over the Black Sea near Russia-annexed Crimea. The Russian Ministry of Defense, which put out this information, added that the drones were conducting intelligence operations but left the area once the fighter jets were deployed. Now we'll be engaging public affairs analyst Mr. Ralph Obasoje, who is speaking to us virtually from Benin, the Edo State capital, the south-south region of Nigeria. Welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you very much. It's nice to be here again.
It's nice to have you. Let's begin with the supply of goods out of Ukraine via the Black Sea. A humanitarian corridor has been promised by Ukraine and to some extent has now been successfully executed. With that humanitarian corridor hugging Bulgaria and Poland, they promised safe passage, and a first vessel from Ukraine, I believe, has arrived in Istanbul. This is regardless of the threat of the Russians in the Black Sea. Do you see this situation as something the Russians will continue to respect and allow to happen? Or is there a foreboding that maybe the next time Ukraine tries to ensure a delivery or passage, the Russians will interfere?
Yes, I don't know the way to put it, but when you look at the whole topography and the expansiveness of the Black Sea, you will find that there are so many exits, but the shortest and the most effective exit is through the strait across Crimea, which Russia has been blocking. If it had been easy for Ukraine to use this alternative route, they would have long done that instead of going into agreements, grain supply agreements with Russia. So something tells you, I mean, we are not there, I and you are not there physically. But something tells you that if this alternative route had been very easy for them to explore, they would have long done that and called the bluff to Russia. Now, whether Russia will want to leave their comfort zone and go further to disrupt supply to this alternative route is something that will be far-fetched, because Russia may then be dragging in other parties that have been passive so far. So I don't think Russia will go through to that extent, but the area where they effectively control, which is the portion of the Black Sea that straddles Crimea and part of Russian territories, that is the ace that they have over the grain supply routes.
I spoke to our earlier guest and I brought to his attention the death of the ace airman, Juice. Dmitro, yes, his name is Andrei Pilishkov, who perished in a training accident. And I'd like your buy-in on this because when you're talking about air combat and you're talking about fighting, being a fighter pilot, it's a very sophisticated undertaking. Also, regarding the type of jet that is being used, when it's a supersonic jet, such as the F-16, then with the time that these pilots have been, which they have to compress their training and compress the delivery of these jets and what they're going to do with them in the training ground, it's a very tall order. Could you speak to this particular issue of the challenge on the hands of the Ukrainian air pilots, the time with which they have to get ready, and what you think may happen next year when it becomes operational?
You see, the retraining of the Ukrainian pilots is actually a reversal shift. When we're studying psychology, you understand? You'll find that pilots that have been trained on Russian-made aircraft, combat aircraft, buttons, and even though the buttons will do similar things, they are not placed in the same, because I was just out of interest following up the cockpit designs of various aircraft, F-14 Tomcat, the F-15 Combat, and F-16. So the numero uno in the US arsenal is the F-16. They don't give it to you easily. So what has happened is a pilot that has flown all his life, a very dexterous pilot and everything, was experiencing a new machine, and that was it. But I don't know why there's so much hype about these F-16 deliveries. The fact is that when they eventually get delivered, I don't have any doubt in my mind, doubt, that they will virtually be piloted by NATO pilots. NATO pilots are not really Ukrainian pilots. And that is what is happening in the battlefront. When you look at the few gains that Ukraine has made in the southern fringes around Zaporizhia, you will find that the West has delivered robotic detectors to detect mines, and they are busy blowing up those mines to create that corridor for them to cross the river into the battlefront.
Pardon the interruption, Mr. Obasanjo. Are you saying that Ukraine will harness will employ the use of non-Ukrainian pilots, and they will use NATO pilots?
They are not really the ones employing it.
The implications.
Yeah, they are not the ones employing it. Yes, they're not the ones employing it. You're not going to see it, but we all know that when they supply equipment, like when the Germans supplied their electronic tanks for to do the battle, which are using now, you will not don't be fooled, because they actually get in both maintenance personnel, ordnance personnel, and those to operate those tanks. And if you go and check the battlefront,
they're Ukrainians. They're not Germans. And if they were Germans, that's something the Russians will pick up on immediately, and that will escalate
yes, it
the
is
war.
Very silent.
And Germany and Ukraine will butt heads, and Germany and then NATO. Russia has an excuse to escalate the fight to include Germany. If Germans, whether by training personnel, by combatants, are involved in using Ukrainian military equipment, then that means Germany is fighting the war.
Yes, but if you see the way it has happened, when those tanks were deployed, they were rapidly deployed. There was no gestation period or lag of time, because Russia was advancing very menacingly, and they needed to stop them. And what I'm telling you is that, you know how the West operates their things. You're going to find that there will be German Ukrainians who will be in the German army who can easily come, or Ukrainian Americans or in the US army who can come. When countries, the secrecy that countries hold with the weapons they manufacture is such that certain operational buttons and the rest, or codes, are not easily known to the enemy. So you don't just bring in German tanks and the tanks begin to get active in at the battlefront very, very quickly. It is just a discerning mind. We know what has happened. At the beginning of the war has been sustained so far. It's not because Ukrainian soldiers are the ones fighting. At the beginning of the war, Poland sent, because Poland is cutting over from Soviet-made weaponry to American systems since they joined NATO, because that is one of the requirements. Your defense system must be compliant and congruent to the NATO architecture so that they can have handshakes. So what happened? Immediately the war broke, Poland shipped most of their Soviet-made T-72 battle tanks, MiG-27 fighter jets, okay, which were now outdated, all right? Now, we're talking about F-16. Russia is calm because they also have an answer to the F-16 in their Sukhoi 29, Sukhoi 30. Okay, Sukhoi 29 is actually a backfire bomber that people cannot pursue. But that is not where we are. We are what I've always said consistently on this platform, on this channel, is the fact that Georgia is better than World War. So I took note of professor that spoke a while ago, who was responding to whether the little team of protesters who are already protesting in Germany, whether it will grow or it will not grow. If you listen to President Macron yesterday, Emmanuel Macron, when he was speaking in a public event at the Champs-Élysées, he did say he thinks that it is time for dialogue. So as the war drags on, all the contributors will become wary, especially when there's really no shift from what Russia had gained by now. And I'm sure that NATO will begin to break ranks. As the war goes on, Ukrainians will be suffering more, as indeed some Russians are also suffering, because there are ethnic Russians in Ukraine. So they're also suffering. And the damage and impact on both sides. People talk about, oh, Russian bombs have killed children. But the attacks from Ukraine also kills children on the other side, also kills human beings on the other side. So I think the world should stand up. And I'm happy that the voice of voices that are calling for restraint and calling for dialogue, the voices are growing. When you monitored all the comments at the BRICS conference in South Africa last week, monitor everything, you'll find that Xi Jinping, all of them, they've been speaking in that direction. You listen to the Russian African Summit that happened 2 weeks ago. You will listen to all the heads of state that spoke, especially Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea. You just listen to what they were all saying. This is a senseless war, in as much as everyone will condemn the invasion. The invasion was not without provocation. And like the Russian president said, he said all this madness is because someone or somebody is thinking of a unipolar world. That will not work, you know. So let us watch how it is going, because this is something, if you don't go into dialogue, this is something that will drag on and drag on and drag on.
Indeed. Finally, what you said earlier concerning your insinuation that maybe citizens of other nationalities aside from Ukraine will be involved in some capacity in combat in the war. The closest, that's not a fact. And the closest that was to a fact was the Pentagon Papers that no one is talking about anymore, that were leaked from the Pentagon, for which the person that leaked them, I believe, is incarcerated, that there were special forces from certain nations who had departed their nations and are in Ukraine helping the Ukrainians. That was not in the public space or domain. And the countries involved were embarrassed that that information leaked. So one of the ways, obviously, that peace will be given a chance is if it's not escalated by other nationals interfering. But finally, as we see that this war is in its 552nd day, what do you think will be a litmus test or the point of no return where this war will either be stopped before next year, hopefully, or it will be escalated beyond next year or to next year?
Yeah, I think you're asking me to be a seer, but before I comment on that very quickly, because I know you are watching your time.
I'm asking you to be optimistic.
Before I comment on that quickly, yes, that's what optimistic, but anything could happen. The pendulum could swing anyway. But let me tell you the issue about these how will I call it, whether there are foreign forces involved or not. You have heard accusations that, Iran is supplying Russia with what do they call it, with drones, all right? And of course, the drones you find on the Ukrainian side are not made by the Ukrainians, all right? But the closest you can guess that there are foreign actors involved was NATO itself and the US itself confirming that they have sent personnel, not combat personnel, but they've sent personnel into Ukraine to train. Germany also said so. We are sending personnel into Ukraine to train Ukrainians on how to use the battle tanks. What are these personnel doing? Training people to use equipment. So in training to use equipment, there could be other things attached to them. But let's leave that off. Like you said, it's not a fact, but we know there are foreign interests involved at the battlefront. But about when it will go to broke, either there is peace or it gets escalated. Those are the things that you had already alluded to. Why is it that Ukraine is not fighting Russia in their territory? Russia is damaging their territory. Because if they cross some Rubicon, your guess will be as good as mine. Russia will deploy heavier weapons, more devastating weapons that they've not used up till now. And like I said on this platform before, they have some advantage because they manufacture those weapons themselves and they just roll it out and they are using, compared to the other countries that will normally do a commercial paper to purchase weapons from weapons manufacturers. It's a different ball game. But the interest we all have, including myself, is to ensure that the sufferings of the teeming masses on both sides, it's stopped. The fear, the apprehension. You can see drones hitting Russia, hitting the train lines, bombs in trains in Russia. It's all sabotage because all is fair in war. Let us not subject ordinary civilians to this fear and apprehension, because when you experience it, it doesn't easily wear off. They should begin, like I've said before, the more than $17 billion that the West has poured into, that was the last time I checked, it should have gone to about 25 billion now, with more weapons being sent. Those resources they are putting in there, let them deploy that money first towards engendering dialogue, and then also rehabilitating the already damaged areas in Ukraine. That would be more humanitarian than prodding a less, how will I call it? You might say they could perform like David against Goliath, but in both instances, you are just telling somebody to go and fight a giant and the person is destroying himself. Before Ukraine, not even Ukraine, also Russia, but before Ukraine can recover from this devastation, it's going to be a minimum of between 10 to 20 years. And that is not, they're going to be going cap in hand, begging for aid to reconstruct their country. Why destroy it further?
Well, we hope
that is my position.
Yes, we hope it gets better before it gets worse.
They should go back to Minsk 2. They should go back to Minsk 2 and review it and get an agreement. Because Russia is not going to renege from protecting ethnic Russians in Ukraine. They will not.
Indeed.
Especially
Thank
in
you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you. And they are most effective naval power. Premier.
Thank you so much. Let's leave it there for now. We hope it does, as I say, get better before it gets worse, and it doesn't get worse than it is. 552 days into this war, and yet it continues. Yes. Thank you so much for your contribution and your.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Mr. Ambassador, Public Affairs Analyst. When we return, Russia tourism in Crimea is down, but many still shrug off the risks. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the passage of a second ship from Ukraine along a temporary Black Sea corridor has nothing to do with the prospects for reviving a grain deal involving Russia. Now, Kyiv had reported a vessel carrying steel product to Africa left Ukraine port of Odessa over the weekend through the temporary humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea. This is the second ship to do so since Russia's withdrawal from the UN-brokered deal that had allowed for grain to be safely exported. At a regular Kremlin briefing, Mr. Peskov reaffirmed Moscow's stance that reviving the grain deal will depend on whether the West delivered on promises regarding Russia's own grain and fertilizer exports. Ukraine and Russia are both leading grain exports. Nearly 33 million tons of Ukrainian grain was exported during the year that the Black Sea deal was harnessed when it was in operation. And now we find that the world of business is affected by the conflict in Ukraine and vice versa. To help us shed light on this is Channels Television business correspondent Laddie Williams. Laddie, good morning.
Good morning.
And welcom back. We haven't seen you in a minute.
Yeah, it's been a while. And I guess it's still on. I was hoping when I come back, the war
things will have been better.
But
no, it's
or even better at least.
It's exacerbated.
Exactly.
I know that you've not been to. If you traveled, you didn't go to somewhere in Ukraine or Russia?
Not at all. Not at all.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
Now, let's begin with the Chicago soybean and corn prices dropped while wheat prices are inching higher. What's driving that sentiment?
Yeah, so it's all eyes on grains at this point. With the stalling of the grain deal at this time, we're seeing that analysts were expecting that, grain prices were going to go up, astronomically. Even with conditions, we're seeing data coming from the U.S., showing that crop conditions are not really good at this point. The forecast, we're seeing really hot and dry weather, coming from the U.S. at this point. So analysts were expecting, anything that, impacts supply definitely would raise prices. But we're seeing prices, come down for most grains, from corn. But we're seeing wheats, edge up, today. Very soon, the Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan is supposed to go to Russia soon. We don't know when. We don't have a date yet, and definitely is trying to get this green deal back on board at this time. So there's a lot to look out for. We're seeing supplies coming from Russia. They're expecting about 5 million tons will be exported in August. That's higher than about 3.5. A year earlier. But for supplies from Ukraine, definitely we've seen like 2 ships now have been able to, go through that Black Sea part. But at this point, Russia is still saying, even though we still see, those 2 ships, of course, doesn't mean the deal is back on.
It's like a ticking time bomb,
Exactly. So
it's like
everyone's still, watching at this point, watching the body language of Russia. But at the end of the day, Tayyip Erdogan is going for that, is going to visit Russia, soon. We're all waiting to see what happens next.
That visit should be significant.
It'll be quite significant. Yeah.
Also, maybe when Russia's foreign minister attends the G20 summit in India, for which Putin says he will not attend for obvious reasons, maybe that's one of the things that will be on the front burner. For sure. That's on the front burner. Because right now, food security is the goal right now globally, with high inflation and food inflation actually rising globally. Yeah, you want to have those soybeans and corn on your breakfast table. You want to have that bread. Yes, you want to be able to afford it. Yeah, you don't want to be thinking about what's happening in Ukraine when you have. Okay, so finally, very quickly, the ruble is strengthening. Oh, yes. Alas. Yes. After a big drop early August, did get to about 100 ruble to $1. But now we're seeing some, strengthening now. The Central Bank of Russia, they blamed it on the negative balance of trade. That has declined by about 90%. And definitely with all the sanctions, we're seeing, exports. It was an economy that used to export a lot, but with the sanctions, we're seeing that most of their exports have been cut and they're having to import. Even the imports are impacted. But with that difference there, we're seeing a big decline, in the balance of trade. So still a lot to look out for. They raised rates last week. That's helped prop up the ruble to about 95 to the dollar. The plot continues to thicken. Thank you, Laddie. Laddie Williams, Channels Television business correspondent. Thank you. Finally on the program, in years past, Serbian Viktor Motorin could hop on a plane and arrive in Crimea just 4 hours later to relax at his holiday apartment, and now he must first fly to Moscow and then spend a day and a half on the train The war in Ukraine, now 18 months old, is making it harder for many Russians to reach their favorite summer haunts in the Black Sea region of Crimea, which Moscow seized and annexed from Ukraine in 2014. Safety now a major factor for some, especially after two major Ukrainian attacks since last October on the 19-kilometer Crimean bridge that links Russia by road and rail to the peninsula. And that's it for today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks to you, our viewers, for watching, our guests for participating, and our producers for producing. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day.